Well, I normally have a much sweeter voice than this one, but I just got a cold, I think, on the train coming in. So you'll have to bear with this. I want to talk about a couple of things. Is there anything wrong with schooling? If so, what? Is there a way to correct schooling or change it, if that is required, and how? So that's a lot of things for 15 minutes. I'm going to try my best. So firstly, if we want to look at the history of present-day schooling, we'll find it quite easily in the last 300 or 400 years. If you look at how the world actually operates or is administered, then in those 300 or 400 years, it was basically a series of empires. Actually, it's longer than 300 or 400 years. It started off with ancient empires, China and Egypt and so on, but I think the schooling system as it is today came from the last 400 years of empire. And empires needed three kinds of people. This kind to run the offices. Remember, there are no computers, no telephones. And this kind to make things. So for 400 years, we needed to produce millions and millions of people like them. And what are the properties of those people? Well, they should be able to understand instructions and follow them. And most importantly, they should not ask questions. And they should not be creative. Imagine if you had an assembly line worker who was creative, your end result might not be quite what you want. So we needed a system that would produce millions of such people. And a very efficient one was invented, this one. All of us are familiar with it. Its purpose was to create those people in very large numbers. It still exists, by and large, unchanged. So we need a transition. And I got to thinking about what's a good analogy of some other area where a transition has happened. Well, there are lots. Well, look at this one. This was the main form of transportation for about the last 300 or 400 years, or longer. It had its own industry, horses and carts and coachmen, and how to maintain horses, how to fuel them, how to build the coaches, the road system, coachman's training, and so on. And that's how we used to get from one point to another. Somewhere along the line, the internal combustion engine came in, and we were told that we don't need the horses anymore. Let's take the horses out and replace it with an internal combustion engine. So everybody would have said, that's cool. I mean, save those poor animals, put in an engine. But something strange happened when that was done. The coachman went away, and the passengers became the drivers, with all its host of problems, humongous increase in accidents, and, well, we're all familiar with it, a licensing system, road signs, all of that. Why? Because there was no driver. We were the drivers, and we are terrible most of the time. But the change happened. One guy went away, and all of us became that. But what happens next is even stranger. From next year, trials will start in this country, and it has already started in America. In fact, Google has a lot to do with it. The driverless car. I love the idea. Imagine what it will do to drinking. So I love it. But the thing is, so you get into this car and you say, take me home, and it takes you home. Something else goes away this time. Not a person, an idea. The idea of driving. So you can imagine a generation which grows up and asks their grandfathers, what does driving mean? And you'd say, oh, driving, we used to have a wheel and a stick, and there were things you had to press with your feet, and then the vehicle would move. And the child would say, you're daft, don't be silly. so that's around the corner. It's going to happen very shortly. So in some cases, you have the person going away, and in some cases, strangely, you have an idea going away. In this case, driving. If you apply that to schooling, you get some very strange results. Can the passengers drive? And can eventually the system drive itself? I bumped into all this from a wrong end, from an experiment I did 15 years ago, just to see what would happen if children who had nothing at all were exposed to a computer and the internet. It's an old story, it's been told many times. What happens is that they learn how to use the internet by themselves. In order to be able to use the internet by themselves, they learn how to read and understand English. And they do all this by themselves because there's nobody there. I used to think that what I was observing was that these poor children were doing all these wonderful things in spite of the fact that there were no teachers. So only down the line I realized that that's not the case. These poor children were learning whatever they were learning and all those wonderful things that they were doing because there was no teacher. If a teacher appeared, the process would stop. All this is published, but obviously didn't make teachers very happy. So let's jump forward a little bit into the future. I think everybody in this room would have a story of a little 2-year-old boy or a 2-year-old girl with an iPad. Nowadays, everybody has a story. Because to us, it's very non-intuitive. How these kids, they're illiterate at that age. Why are they so good with the iPads? Well, I've seen it before. It's the hole in the wall coming back in a different form. I have a lovely story from Newcastle. A colleague of mine was walking around with her daughter, who was less than 2 years old, actually. And the daughter said to her, after looking at a sign, said to her, S-T-O-P, stop. So the mother sort of said, what? How did you do that? It's simple. It's S-T-O-P, stop. And her mother said, so what does it mean? And the little girl looked up at her and said, who cares? So, it's a different take on learning. So on the right side of this slide, you have this picture of hopefully a future plumber. So you call this plumber, and today's plumber comes in there and you're at his mercy. He opens your sink and he looks inside and he takes this off and buys something else and puts it in. Tomorrow's plumber comes in there, he opens the bottom of your kitchen sink and he says, I've never seen this before. This is a new joint. And then he pulls out his iPad and he figures out what he should do. In other words, everything he learned in plumbing school goes away and he has to learn instantly in seconds how to do his job all over again. And going by my transportation analogy, that too doesn't last for too long. Because the next generation of plumber after this guy, he comes in there and you say there's a leak and he goes in and he says the leak is fixed, ma'am. And you say, what did you do? And he says, I asked the leak to fix itself. That will happen. I mean, you've seen bits of technology in the last lecture which showed you how these things will happen that way. So, so we have to look at the future of lots of things, but particularly the future of reading, writing, and arithmetic, which are the pillars of what? Reading, writing, and arithmetic are the pillars on which a good clerk stands. If you finished your schooling and decided that you would do no other studying at all, no further education, nothing, what kind of a job could you get? You have a couple of options. ASDA or a clerk, if you can find a bureaucratic office still with clerks and typewriters. So reading, writing, and arithmetic, when challenged, people get really defensive about. But look at reading. Why is it so important to be able to read? We consider very, very fundamental. Look at writing. And that's even more, what a human invention it is. Well, what is writing? Writing is making scratch marks on a surface in order to represent human speech. So if I say something, you can take out a thin piece of wood, paper, and make scratch marks on it to record what I said. A very poor quality recording device because it's very prone to misunderstanding. And we sort of say that that's a great advantage because, that's the origin of literature. One person writes, the other person reads and understands completely different. And he can make his own imagery and so on and so forth. Okay, if you like. But as a recording device, writing is a pretty poor one. We have better ones now. So if you had to describe a mountain, instead of writing a poem about it, you could actually just point your smartphone at it and then WhatsApp it to whoever. And lastly comes arithmetic. What happens to arithmetic? I mean, that one is really terrible, isn't it, to say that could the days of arithmetic be over? Is it really important to know how to do arithmetic the way we all know it? It's been drilled into us since we were little children. Suppose you buy something for 69 pounds and you have to pay a tax of 12.4% on it. Everyone in this room, I hope, knows how to take out a piece of paper, write 69 into 12.4 line. You remember the method? Multiply, shift to the left, multiply, add up. All of us know how to do it. And I can say with equal confidence, no one in this room is daft enough to do it that way. So why did we waste all that time? What was the point? Oh, but it's important to know what multiplication is. I don't think it's such a difficult concept. I think we know multiplication very well. There wouldn't be 7 billion of us if we didn't. And again, another thought comes to my mind. We think that assistive devices hurt our knowledge base. Spell checkers will make us poor spellers. Calculators will make us poor at arithmetic. I don't think so. It needs a couple of experiments. But I don't think a child growing up with a calculator will necessarily be arithmetically illiterate. It might be just the opposite. A child growing up with a spell checker will make the mistake once, twice, and not make it the third time. Assistive technologies can teach. We need to test it, but we do need to examine the future of reading, writing, and arithmetic. So I'm experimenting with what are called self-organized learning environments. It's basically that old hole-in-the-wall experiment brought into the classrooms of regular schools. It's very easy to do. Empty the classroom out, put in 4 or 5 computers, put about 1 computer for every 4 learners. I work with children. Let the children in, so they'll say, why are there so few computers? And you say, I don't know, that's the way it is. And then you ask them something really, really interesting. Okay, that's the art the teacher needs to learn. What's a really interesting question? Well, for example, why is it that different people in different parts of the planet have differently colored hair? Give that to 9-year-olds and watch them. Watch them come up with DNA, anthropology, social adaptation. Basically, stuff that you would teach them at the undergraduate level will emerge out of that question in about 40 minutes. And there are hundreds of such questions you can drive a system with. Here's what a soul looks like.
Electrical charge. The net charge on an ion is
Well, you get the idea. I mean, this is an Australian child. She's talking at least 10, 15 years ahead of her time. Because I'd asked her, what's a proton? And that's what they came up with. The Aborigine child next to her, she says, she's understood how it all works, and I've made a picture of it. All this has helped if you have an adult there, not a teacher, but an admiring adult, someone who encourages. So back in 2009, I'd put out an appeal in the Guardian newspaper saying that if you're a British grandmother, if you have broadband and a web camera, then can you give me 1 hour a week of your time for free? In 2 weeks, I got 200. I know more British grandmothers than anyone in this room. they form what's called the granny cloud. I mean, they're actually men and women, young women. But they're people who have interest and are willing to give 1 hour of their time every week for free. And I beam them. And I beam them all over the world into schools and into children where they don't teach. They just stand there watching, and every now and then they say, wow, how did you do that? So here's how it looks.
Give yourselves a clap. Absolutely.
Hello, I'm Tim.
How are you?
I'm all right. Have you heard of the footballer?
Okay, I'm almost out of time. So you get the idea that it's an interaction. So souls caught on all over the world, and a lot of this stuff flowed into popular culture. The person who wrote Slumdog Millionaire said, I got inspired by the hole-in-the-wall experiment. Wired magazine found a school in Mexico that went to the top of the league tables by a teacher who I've never met, who said, I read about this and I applied it and it worked. And cricket, which, I've never played it. Mike Atherton said, maybe new techniques come from a hole-in-the-wall kind technique, method in cricket. So I have a suggestion of how to change the system. It's a very simple suggestion. You start with the assessment, not with curriculum, pedagogy, methodology, and so on. Here is the office of about 100 years ago. Lines of clerks and a floor supervisor. Here's an examination, end of school examination in India, 2014. Isn't it quite obvious? Let me see if I can go back one step. Isn't it quite obvious what we are trying to produce? We've just got to slip out of that. We've got to recognize this is what's happening. Offices are going to look like this. And if you have to prepare people for these offices, their examination system has to look like this. That's all you need. You have to let the internet into the examination hall. If a question says, use the internet to figure out why people have different colored hair, teachers will teach differently, curriculum makers will make curriculum differently, examiners will write different questions. The whole system will change. So I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Sugata, you've done some amazing work that's become famous, the idea that people can educate yourself if they only have the tools and access to the network. How far have you got in persuading the traditional establishment in education that they should move towards these proven methods?
I have good news. Until about 2 years ago, I would have said I've done very poorly because governments don't understand. In the last 2 years, I've had contact from all 5 continents, from governments saying, what should we do? Okay, including, I'm happy to say, this country. So I don't have a prescription, obviously, but to each one of them now I'm saying, try this experiment with assessment just once for one subject, and you'll understand what the whole thing is about.
Well, you're in demand globally. We're lucky to have you here. Thank you, Sugata Mitra.